When I first met Daniel Brooks, I thought he was like any other patient, quiet, with eyes that spoke for more than I could comprehend. He was here only for routine checkups, tall and well-body massed in the late 40s with salt and pepper hair and a smiling politeness about him. His medical history also documented quite unremarkable health problems. I never expected him to change my life or that he and his wife would drag me into something much darker than I had been prepared for. I entered his room, straightened my scrubs, and gave him a professional smile. "Good afternoon, Mr. Brooks," I greeted him, trying to ignore the unsettling feeling in my stomach. My heart was racing, but I brushed it off as merely nerves for the first day on the job. It wasn't the first time that I had assisted a patient, but there was something different about him. "Everything okay?" I asked, noticing how he fidgeted on the bed. His gaze flickered to mine, then quickly away, almost as if he were concealing something. "Yes, just a bit uneasy," he replied. The tone of his voice was even, yet tight, and it immediately made me feel that he wasn't telling me the whole truth. I tried to lighten the mood as I neared him to adjust his gown, professional detachment important, but as I reached for him, the gown moved, and for a second, I had seen too much. My face flushed red as I looked quickly away, pretending not to have seen anything. "Let's get you set for your exam," I said, trying to sound composed. He was still watching me, and for the first time, something was different in his eyes, an edge of intensity that unnerved and fascinated me. Far too intimate a gaze, in the setting of a clinic, which made my hands shake ever so slightly. I finished quickly, smiled politely, and left the room, trying to shake off the strange feeling that lingered. The next day, while doing my rounds, I received a message asking me to assist Mr. Brooks again. My heart fluttered. Why would he ask for me specifically? It felt like something more, and I couldn't ignore the little voice telling me to be cautious. When I entered his room, he greeted me with a warmer smile, more confident than before. "Thank you for coming, Sarah," he said softly, almost as if we shared some secret. "It's my job, Mr. Brooks," I replied, keeping my tone neutral. Our eyes met, and something passed between us that I didn't want to acknowledge. His calm, steady presence filled the room, and I found myself captivated. "You've been very kind to me. It's rare," he said quietly, his voice low, almost conspiratorial. Before I could respond, the door opened. I turned to see his wife, Claire Jacobsa, striking woman in her late 30s, with a sharp, knowing gaze. She looked at us, her gaze darting from one of us to the other, and my heart raced. She nodded abruptly and was out of the room without ever saying another word. Mr. Brooks smiled, though something in his face had shifted. It was as if he'd been caught at something, but rather than looking ashamed, he seemed to be enjoying it. "My wife," he stated matter-of-factly, "a complicated woman." I mustered a tight, thin smile and excused myself, my mind racing as I closed the door behind me. There was an energy between him and Claire that was simply indescribable, more than tension alone could account for. In the days to follow, Mr. Brooks found ways to see more of me. Each encounter became more obviously tense than the last. One afternoon, reaching for his foreline, he caught my hand, holding it a little too long, his touch lingering on my skin. I pulled away, shaken more than I wanted to admit, but the thrill that coursed through me couldn't be denied. This wasn't a patient anymore. He had crossed a line, and I had allowed it. Later that week, I was in the break room, trying to untangle my feelings, when suddenly Claire just showed up beside me, out of nowhere, and intimidating. "Sarah," she said, cool and sharp, "I need to talk to you." I nodded, trying not to show my unease, and followed her to an empty hallway. She turned to me, her unreadable expression and dark eyes valuing me. "I know what you think you're doing," she said softly, almost a whisper, "and am warning you, stay away from him." My throat tightened, and I tried to respond, "Mrs. Jacobs, I don't know what you mean. I'm just his nurse." She cocked her head, a bitter smile on her lips. "Don't insult me, Sarah. I see the way he looks at you, I see the way you look back at him. But you need to understand something, Lucas isn't what he seems." A chill ran down my spine. Her warning felt less like jealousy and more like something darker, something I didn't quite understand. Before I could question her further, she turned and walked away, leaving me with more questions than answers. That evening, while leaving the hospital, I saw Mr. Brooks. He was waiting by the entrance, leaning casually against the wall. He looked up when he saw me, his eyes lighting up with a warmth I knew I should resist. "Sarah," he greeted, as if he'd been waiting for me all day. "Mr. Brooks," I replied, my tone firm, but my resolve weakened under his gaze. He stepped closer, the air between us electric. "Lucas," he corrected softly, coaxingly. "Lucas, this isn't right," I stammered, trying to take a step backward, but my feet seemed stuck to the ground. "You have no reason to be afraid of her," he said, his tone low and smooth, sending a shiver down my spine. "My wife, she likes to control things, but she can't control how I feel about you." Every fiber in my being yelled to turn around and walk away, but the words had stirred something dangerous inside of me. It was intoxicating, this attention, this flirtation wrapped in secrecy. Yet deep down, I knew there was more to this than what met the eye. Just as he reached for my hand, Claire's cold voice interrupted, "Sarah." I turned to see her standing behind us, her face an icy mask. She looked at me, then him, in one swift motion, and in that instant, I knew this was some sort of game, but the rules were unknown. The way she stared was as if her gaze went right through me, sharp as a razor. Mute, I yanked my hand free and walked away, back into the dark, leaving them both that way. The days that followed were quiet with tension, whispers, and messages from Mr. Brooks to see him. I tried my best to avoid him, but it was pointless. He'd find his way to reel me back in, his eyes ensnaring me, his words hushed and begging. One evening, Claire found me in a deserted hallway and stopped me, placing a hand on my arm. "Sarah, you need to know who he is," she said, her voice low, almost soft. She handed me a file, her fingers cold against mine. "Read this." With considerable reluctance, I opened it, and photos and documents out of a much different picture came together of the man I thought I knew. He had a secret, entangled past that ran a chill down my spine. I looked up at her. "Why are you showing me this?" She smiled, an arresting glitter in her eyes. "Because I want you to understand, Sarah, he's not who you think he is." And in that moment, I understood the complex web of attraction, jealousy, and power between Mr. and Mrs. Brooks was more tortuous than I had ever imagined. It wasn't about infidelity or temptation, it was a game of control and manipulation, and I had been pulled into it without even realizing. My mind swirled with questions as I walked away. Who was Mr. Brooks really, and what did his wife stand to gain from warning me about him? One thing was certain, I couldn't trust either of them. But the temptation to dig into the truth was fire that I couldn't put out. During the coming days, I found myself divided between the strong attachment I still had toward Mr. Brooks and the disturbing images and documents Claire had let me see. Dark thoughts invaded my mind each time I replayed her words. I felt caught between their hidden agendas, as if both of them had set traps for me, and could not even trust myself. A week later, my phone chimed with a message while I was on a rare break in the staff lounge. It was from the hospital receptionist, and as I read it, my heart just sank. "Mr. Brooks has personally requested you for his evening appointment." The note felt like a hook that drew me back into the game, the tangled web between him and Claire. Although every rational part of my mind wanted me to turn this request down, I found myself standing at his door that evening, catching my breath, then going inside. When I opened the door, he peered from the bed with a smooth smile, as if nothing strange had ever happened between us. "Sarah," he said in a soft voice that somehow was soothing and calculated all at one time. "It's nice seeing you." I forced a polite smile onto my face and tried to keep the conversation as short and sweet as possible. "I'm here to help with your evening checks," I reminded myself to keep professional. He seemed to sense my guardedness. "I'm sorry," he said softly, almost apologetically. "About my wife, she can be intense." "She had some concerns," I said carefully, my voice still wavering from my earlier conversation with Claire. "Concerns about you?" He sighed, his smile reappearing. "She doesn't understand," he added, his eyes never leaving mine. "What we have, this connection, it's real, Sarah. You can feel it, can't you? The tremble in his voice shook me. All I knew about him, and yet a part of me wanted to believe him most of the time. Maybe Claire was wrong, maybe he was just lonely, stuck in an unhappy marriage, with a wife who bullied him into doing her bidding. But then again, the photos, the documents, proof of something darker, and I couldn't unsee that. I don't know what I feel, I said, stepping away, trying to gain some clarity. And I don't think this is appropriate, Mr. Brooks, I added, his name feeling odd on my lips. Lucas, he corrected softly. Please, call me Lucas. His gaze softened, and for a moment, he seemed like a man in need of saving. But just as I felt my defenses start to break down, I recalled Claire's warning, her chilling smile as she turned over the files to me, the shocking truths she had unveiled. It all came back in a rush, and I knew I needed to bring this to a close. I think it's best if I ask another nurse to care for you from now on, I said, my voice firm, though my hands were shaking. For a moment, he seemed taken aback, his face hardening slightly. You don't need to be afraid of her, Sarah, he said sharply. You don't need to be afraid of me either. There was an edge to his voice that ran a shiver down my spine. I'm not afraid of you, I replied, though I didn't exactly mean it. He leaned forward, eyes darkening. Good, he whispered, the words sounding far more like a threat than a reassurance. Because I have a way of getting what I want. That night, I lay in bed, my brain racing with snippets of every interaction ID had with him and with his wife. They were playing a game, that much was obvious. But I didn't know who held the winning hand, or if I'd been the prize they'd been after this whole time. Days turned into an interlude of avoiding him in careful dodges and shift swaps whenever possible. But no matter how well I did it, I couldn't get rid of that feeling watched. Glimpses of him in the hall, his eyes following me, his smile almost taunting me. It would happen every so often, a pair of eyes on me, not his. Claire Jacobs would show up, only so long as for me to notice her, cold and piercing gaze, reminding me she was still there, still attentive to everything going on. Then one evening, as I was finishing up my last shift, I heard a voice behind me. Sarah. I turned around to see Claire Jacobs standing in the dim light of the hallway, her expression unreadable. She stared at me, her gaze as sharp as a knife. I need to show you something, she said with a voice barely above a whisper. It's about Lucas. I was hesitant, the desperation in her tone drew me in, though. She silently led me down some quiet corridor away from the buzz of the hospital ward into an empty office, and she shut the door right behind us, quietly and deliberately. You need to know the truth, she said, her voice bitter. About my husband. My heart was racing as she handed me another file, her hand held on a little longer than it needed to, her eyes narrowing as she peered into mine. You are not the first, you know, she almost pitted. He has done this before many times. And with that, I opened the folder, and my breath got caught as I scanned the pages. Full of emails, messages printed out to and from other women, other nurses. The same words, the same charm, the same haunting look in their eyes when he played his game, winning them over only to feel special before he discarded them. My stomach was twisting as I realized how deep the deception went. Why are you showing me this? I asked, my voice still shaking. Because, she replied, her tone cold and firm, I don't want to lose to him. He's done this for too long, and he needs to be stopped. She leaned in closer, her eyes narrowing. We can end this together, Sarah. But I need you to play along just a little longer. My mind was reeling. She was asking me to stick close to him, to behave as though nothing was different, but now, I'd be a part of her plan, a piece in her chess game of revenge. Over the next weeks, I did as she bid me, keeping up appearances, pretending that I was still taken in by Mr. Brooks' charms. I went to his room on a regular basis, pretending to be cool, and observed him playing his game, without even a suspicion that his wife and I were collaborating. Each time we met, I would pick up something, anything that Claire asked for, and store it in my memory. I was cautious, observing him, just waiting for the crack, for him to show his real face. But as time passed, I felt increasingly conflicted. He was still the charming, mysterious man I'd first met, and despite all that ID learned about him, I couldn't quite turn those feelings off. I despised myself for it, but part of me still craved his notice, that kick of the taboo that had initially attracted me to him. It wasn't until one evening that he finally faced me, the edges of his voice tinged with exasperation. "Sarah, you've been distant," he whispered, his hand reaching for mine with that same look in his eyes, the look that once got me. "Is there something wrong?" I drew my hand away, forcing a smile. "No, Lucas, everything's fine." He didn't believe me, and his eyes narrowed slightly. I even saw a flicker of suspicion. He was catching on, he realized something was different. I felt a surge of fear, wondering if he knew about my alliance with his wife, if he was already planning his next move. Later that night, Claire Jacobs sent me a message that her words were urgent, laced with urgency. "Meet me in the office now." I slipped away from the ward into the waiting woman in the same deserted room where we'd met. She looked more on edge than I'd ever seen her face pale, her hands clenched. "It's time," she said, her voice low. "Tonight we end this. I have everything I need." She handed me a key, her eyes fierce. "You know what to do." I felt a burst of fear mixed with expectation as I took the key, knowing this was at the moment we had been waiting for. I'd go in his room one last time, under the guise of another routine check, but this time armed with every piece of damning evidence that we had against him. I did hesitate and glanced back at her, unsure if I was ready to follow through. But she nodded, her gaze steely. "Do it, Sarah. End this once and for all." As I made my way down the dimly lit hallway, my heart thundered in my chest. I felt the weight of every choice ID made, every line ID crossed, and I knew that after tonight, there would be no turning back. I took a deep, steadying breath as I reached the door to his room, clutching the key Claire Jacobs had given me like a lifeline. My mind was racing, jumbled thoughts and emotions tangling in a mass I couldn't seem to unravel. But this was at the end of the game. One way or another, I would leave this room with the truth and finally break their web of deceit. The room was in dark, silent, but for the soft hum of the medical monitors. Mr. Brooks lay back on the bed, eyes closed. For a moment, I thought he might be sleeping, but as I moved closer, his eyes opened and he looked at me with that familiar gaze both inviting and unsettling. "Sarah," he murmured, a soft smile touching his lips. "I didn't think you'd come back tonight." "Why wouldn't I?" I asked, trying to keep my tone light, though my heart was pounding in my chest. I forced myself to remember why I was here, to stick to the plan. He reached out, his hand hovering just over mine. "You seem distant," he said softly, "and I've missed you." The sincerity in his voice almost shook my resolve, but I knew what he was, what had done to so many others. I couldn't let his charm sway me, not now. "I think we should talk, Lucas," I said, my voice shaking as I pushed the words out, "about everything." His expression shifted slightly, a flash of caution in his eyes, but he covered it a moment later with the same charming smile. "Of course," he said suavely, motioning me to sit beside him. I sat down, hardly aware of the bed frame beneath me as I clutched the file ID brought with me. I took a deep breath, steeling myself. "Your wife," I began. "She told me things, showed me things about you." He stilled, his face losing some of its warmth. "My wife," he began slowly, his voice dropping as if weighing his words carefully. "My wife doesn't understand me, Sarah. You know that. She has her own issues. She's always trying to control everyone around her, even me. I thought you could see that." I opened the file, my hands shaking as I held up the documents and photographs Claire Jacobs had given me, the messages, the intimate photos with other nurses, women he charmed, manipulated, and discarded. I forced myself to look him in the eye. "These women, they thought you cared about them, like you led me to believe you cared about me." For a moment, he just stared at the photographs, his face unreadable. Then a slow, chilling smile crept over his lips. "Sarah," he said softly, his voice dropping to a whisper, "you think you're any different?" The word slapped me, and a chill ran down my spine. He bent closer, his face inches from mine, his eyes dark and intense. You were so easy to convince, he whispered, oozing derision with his voice. Willing to see the best in me, to ignore all the warning signs, just like the others. A wave of nausea washed over me as the implication of his words settled upon me. He had played me like he had played all the others. I felt sick not only for believing him but for letting myself be drawn so deeply into his twisted game. I trusted you, I whispered, feeling the full weight of my foolishness. He laughed then, a low, hollow, and bitter sound. That's the thing, Sarah. You're all so eager to believe the lie, to think you're special. But you're not. He leaned back, his gaze cold and calculating. And neither is my wife. I gripped the file, every nerve in my body screaming to leave, to run as far as I could from him. But I knew I couldn't, not yet. So what now? I managed to ask, my voice shaking. That depends, he said, his tone smooth once more. You could forget all of this, walk away, and I won't hold this against you. His smile twisted. Or you could make this harder on yourself, but I wouldn't recommend it. At that point, I knew he wasn't only manipulating me, but threatening me. I got up, my legs unsteady, yet I refused to let him see just how afraid I was. You're not going to get away with this, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. Your wife knows everything. She's not afraid of you anymore. His smile faltered, a brief flash of anger crossing his face. She won't do anything, he muttered, almost to himself. She's always been too weak to stand up to me. And now I have all the evidence I need to make sure she keeps her mouth shut. Just then, the door to the room creaked open, and Claire Jacobs stepped inside, her face a mask of steely determination. She glanced between us, her gaze settling on me with a hint of approval, before turning to her husband. You're right, Lucas, she said icily. I've been too weak. But not anymore. He stared at her, his face clouded with a mix of shock and anger. What do you think you're doing? He spat, the calm exterior finally cracking. I'm taking back control, she responded, her voice firm. She held up a small recorder, her finger poised over the play button. And I have everything I need. His eyes widened, a flicker of panic flashing across his face as he realized what she'd done. She'd recorded our entire conversation, every vile word had said, every threat, every admission. And now she held the power. You won't get away with this, he sneered, his voice low and dangerous, but there was fear there too, fear he couldn't quite mask. Claire Jacobs only smiled, her expression calm and composed. You've underestimated me, Lucas, just like you underestimated Sarah. But I'm done playing by your rules. With that, she turned to me, her gaze softer, more vulnerable. Sarah, I know I asked you to help me, and I know this hasn't been easy. But it's over now. I nodded, relief flooding through me as I realized I was finally free. I didn't need to stay in this twisted game anymore, since she had all she needed to bring him down, to put an end to his manipulation once and for all. As I walked out of that room, a weight began to lift off my shoulders. This was a sense of liberation I hadn't felt in weeks. I was done with Lucas Brooks, done with the lies, the games. And I knew that no matter what came next, I'd never let anyone have that kind of power over me again. In weeks that followed, rumors trickled in around the hospital about Mr. Brooks and his wife. I didn't ask for the details. I didn't want to know. It was enough to know that Claire Jacobs had finally gathered the courage to come forward with the truth, and that Lucas had received some consequences he couldn't talk or manipulate his way out of. As for me, I found peace in moving forward, knowing I was safe from something big and bad, something dark that almost consumed me. I went back to my work, my life, and the things that mattered most, stronger, wiser, and forever changed.